Good afternoon. It's great to be here. My name is Bernard Nickel, and it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of the Department of Philosophy to the 59th Whitehead Lectures in Philosophy. The Alfred North Whitehead Lectures began in 1957 and have continued with some lapses during the 70s and 80s annually since then. The lectures have been given by such distinguished philosophers as Gilbert Ryle, P.F. Strawson, Alan Gibbard, Barbara Herman, Dorothy Edgington, Bob Stolnicker, and Amy Thomason. And while the lectures are named after Whitehead, they were established through the generosity of Edwin de Turck Bechtel. Bechtel of the Harvard College class of 1905 was a great benefactor of the department who loved philosophy, but was grateful for the advice he received from William James not to make a career in it. He wound up doing something far more lucrative, both to his and our benefit. The Whitehead endowments reflect the esteem Mr. Bechtel had for Whitehead, whom he came to know after Whitehead joined the Harvard faculty in the 1920s. In his gift, Mr. Bechtel stipulated that the Whitehead lecturer be a distinguished scholar or other qualified person who would give a lecture on a philosophical subject. Now, these lectures are named after one of the several great philosophers who called our department home during the first half of the 20th century. Alfred North Whitehead retired from the Department of Philosophy here at Harvard in 1937, having arrived from Imperial College London 13 years before. Whitehead's influence on the students of our department was important, even if he was, as is a bit in the Harvard Crimson from 1948 states, for the majority of Harvard students, no more than a name uttered reverently in the comparative sanctity of seminar or professorial conference. Whitehead's most notable influence was on our own W.V.O. Quine, whose supervisor he was during the 2 years it took him to write his PhD. But he was also, of course, a great mentor to Bertrand Russell earlier in his career at Trinity College, Cambridge, and the two worked together for a decade to complete the famous Principia Mathematica, on which Quine's dissertation was based. Now, Principia is probably his best-known work. His best-known doctrine is probably his metaphysical view centered around process philosophy. It is a daunting view, hard to interpret, and I wouldn't be surprised if its relative inaccessibility contributed significantly to that reverent uttering of his name that we heard about in the Crimson a bit. And yet, Whitehead was also a man of parts. In addition to these extraordinarily abstract, perhaps abstruse doctrines, he also had a long and abiding interest in the philosophy of education. I was struck, for instance, by these remarks from a piece called Technical Education and its Relation to Science and Literature. There he says, "No course of study can claim any position of ideal completeness. The insistence in the Platonic culture on disinterested intellectual appreciation is a psychological error. Action or implication in the transition of events amid the inevitable bond of cause to effect are fundamental. An education which strives to divorce intellectual or aesthetic life from these fundamental facts carries with it the decadence of civilization." Especially in these days, Whitehead's words resonate with me. Our lives are integrated wholes in which all the different ways of relating to the world contribute to a fully realized life, an appreciation of science, of history, of the arts, the humanities. And so it is only fitting that we come together as a community over our shared love of philosophy so that we can nourish these parts of ourselves, even as we live through times that try our souls. With that, let me cede the floor to my colleague, Samantha Mathern, to introduce our speaker today.
It is my great pleasure to introduce Lucy Allais, professor of philosophy at the University of Witwatersand, I know I said it wrong, in Johannesburg, and Miller professor of philosophy at Johns Hopkins. Professor Allais is one of the world's leading scholars of the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. Her groundbreaking book, Manifest Reality, is one in which she tackles some of the thorniest issues in Kant's metaphysics and epistemology, including his account of the relationship between appearances and things in themselves and intuitions and concepts. In an interpretation that is as exciting as it is elegant, Allais argues that although Kant thinks some aspects of reality are mind-dependent, spatiotemporal objects exist. And this reality, she also argues, is one we are directly acquainted with in perception. This is part of her influential, non-conceptualist interpretation of intuition. There are things that exist, and we perceive them, a refreshingly down-to-earth interpretation of Kant's transcendental idealism. No more satisfied than Kant was with working only on metaphysics and epistemology, Allais has worked extensively on issues pertaining to agency, moral psychology, and political philosophy. Engaging with phenomena as difficult to understand as they are vital to our moral and political lives, she's written articles on freedom, forgiveness, fragility, punishment, poverty, racism, and HIV. In this spectacular oeuvre, Allais remains steadfast in a commitment to doing philosophy in a way that remains grounded in what Kant calls the bathos of experience. Whether she is defending a theory of perception, idealism, free will, or evil, she trains her focus on these as real human phenomena, and sometimes animal phenomena too. To borrow some words from one of Allais's favorite novels, George Eliot's Middlemarch, the light Allais commands is for the, quote, particular web of certain human lots, and how they are woven and interwoven. But beyond her many philosophical contributions, Allais models something more for us. When she enrolled in university, she planned on pursuing a degree in fine arts. For coincidental reasons, her first year, she found her way to a philosophy class taught by Michael Pendlebury, father of Thomas Pendlebury of this program. And as she tells it, it was, quote, love at first sight. To borrow some other words from Middlemarch, though we are, quote, not afraid of telling over and over stories about how people fall in love with one another, rarely are we told the love story of a, quote, intellectual passion. The story of the moment the world, quote, is made new by a presentiment of endless processes filling the vast spaces planked out by knowledge. But Allais's life and work as a philosopher is one such love story, and I could not be happier to hear the next chapter shared with us today and tomorrow, Human Free Agency, a sketch. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Lucy Allais for her first Whitehead lecture, An Antinomy of Agency.
Well, that must definitely be the nicest introduction I've ever had. Middlemarch, isn't it? Thank you so much. So my aim in these lectures is to present the first two parts of an account of human agency that I'm currently working on. The idea of the book project is to sketch a picture of human free agency that brings together its metaphysical, rational or moral, and political aspects. So obviously those are all enormous projects on their own, and they could each be books, but my project is to think about free agency by understanding these parts in relation to each other. So I'm using the word sketch deliberately. The idea is that working out the broad outlines of a big picture, in which we understand these three aspects of freedom in relation to each other, might help us see through some of the tangles of the free will debate. So these lectures will be a sketch of a sketch. So for lectures like these, it seems like presenting a big, ambitious picture is appropriate, but obviously it also has some pitfalls, especially when you're still at the stage of working out what you think. And it's in the nature of the topic that there are just enormous areas of philosophy that it touches on at every point, in mind and action and metaphysics and science and practical reason. And I can't sketch a big picture and argue for each bit in detail, and also never mind situated in relation to all the many things many people have said. So I'm just going to go for it. So the account of human free agency that sees its metaphysical, rational or moral, and political aspects as essential parts of one picture is a picture I find in Kant. and I'll refer to Kant at various times. But my main interest here is how to understand the ideas philosophically, how they fit together, how this might help us understand free agency, and I won't spend much time discussing the extent to which the things I'm saying are grounded in Kant's texts, although I'm always happy to talk about that. So something that might seem surprising about the idea that the view I'm presenting is Kantian is that the picture is intended to be, in a certain sense, broadly naturalistic. And Kant is not often thought of in this way. So Kant's account of free will, in particular, is often thought of as wildly non-naturalistic, involving timeless nominalist metaphysics. I think that's the wrong way to understand it, but I won't argue for that here. My aim is to draw on a strand in Kant's account of metaphysics, what I'll call his critique of rationalistic empiricism, which I take to be helpful in making sense of free will. So it's, of course, surprisingly difficult to define naturalism. It's easy to say that we shouldn't invoke supernatural entities in trying to explain the world. But what makes an entity natural? Are economic forces unnatural? Naturalism is, of course, sometimes understood in terms of physicalism or materialism. Those are also tricky to undefine. There's surely an ordinary sense in which an elephant is a physical being. They can squash you. And an elephant is surely a natural being. Elephants don't, of course, feature in the terms of fundamental physics. So if naturalism is the philosophical view that what really exists is only what features in the terms of the most fundamental physics, then it might be that we don't yet know what's natural and elephants aren't natural. But I don't see any reason to start by thinking that, so that bosons are natural and elephants aren't. So the account of free will I'm working on, and which I do take to be Kantian, is one that doesn't need supernatural metaphysics, or even panicky metaphysics, so-called contracausal powers, but it does require rejecting a certain kind of reductive and imperialistic physicalism. So one thing I find helpful about starting with Kant is that his position cuts through some of the terminology and positions in the contemporary debate. So the position I want to argue for is an account of agency that does not require objective chanciness in the laws of nature, does not require that free actions have no causal antecedents, or that there are breaks in the unfolding of the world according to natural laws. But it is a view in which agency is not compatible with metaphysical determinism, as that view is usually understood in the free will debate. Agency, as I understand it, involves the agent at the time of acting being able to do something or not do it, and to have some control over how the doing unfolds. And along with Helen Stewart, I take this also to be true of the agency of other animals. So Helen has this wonderful book where she argues that animals' agency isn't compatible with metaphysical determinism, and I'm arguing for that as well. So, and I think that thinking about agency from this perspective helps shift some of the issues in the free will debate. And that's my topic for today, what I'm going to call the causality of agency. Tomorrow's lecture will look at how combining reason with this account of agency helps to make sense of free and responsible agency, and I'll very briefly gesture towards the third part of the picture, the idea of being able to exercise your agency for yourself in conditions of non-domination. So in agreement with Stewart, I think that the causality of agency is something that isn't compatible with metaphysical determinism and can't be made sense of from the perspective of physical reductivism. But I think it is potentially compatible with deterministic physical laws. So lots of writing in the free will debate runs together the idea of metaphysical determinism and the idea that the laws of physics are deterministic. But I think these are distinct. So I'm understanding metaphysical determinism as the view that given the state of the universe and the laws of nature, at any one moment there's only one possible future. But I take it that the idea that there is only one possible future doesn't just follow from the nature of the laws of physics. It further depends on whether or not we're dealing with a system that is closed under the physical laws in question. So I take it that whether or not the laws of physics are deterministic is an empirical question, and something scientists can in principle find out. It might be that probabilistic laws are necessary for the quantum fluctuations that made the Big Bang, or for the way brains work, or the origins of life. And if that's the case, then probabilistic laws are necessary for agency. So I say free agency is possibly compatible with deterministic laws. I assume that's an empirical question. What I don't think we need for free agency is probabilistic laws that somehow allow gaps at the right places for our choices to be inserted. So I think we learn about the laws of physics empirically, but I don't think it's easy to make sense of metaphysical determinism as an empirical thesis, although it's quite often treated that way in the philosophical debate. I take it to be a philosophically tempting way of thinking about a picture of the world we take physical science to give us. In Kant's terms, I take it to be a transcendent metaphysical picture, and I'll come back to say a bit more about that. So it's presumably a large part of the appeal of standard compatibilism that it's supposed to be the view that takes science seriously and it fits into a naturalistic, empirically respectable worldview, and one of my goals is to push back against that assumption. So an idea I take from Kant is that there's something problematic about claims about the universe as a whole, as a totality. We can't properly understand such claims as empirical. And I think our intuitions about what is or is not compatible with a claim about the total state of the universe are not very likely to be informative. In the free will debate, we're often presented with cases in which we're said, your action is a determined function of previous states of the universe, and then we're asked to examine our intuitions about whether this action is responsible. But it's just assumed that there's action. And I think that's smuggled in. It begs the question against what Stewart calls agency incompatibilism. If agency incompatibilism is or might be true, our intuitive responses to such questions will be distorted by the fact that agency has been smuggled in. One of the many difficulties in the free will debate is that there isn't any agreement in philosophy on how to understand what causation is, what laws of nature are, what necessitation is, what it means to say something metaphysically determines or grounds something else. Janan Ismail points out that since special relativity eliminates the idea of absolute simultaneity, it means that scientifically speaking, there is no total state of the universe at any one time. So there can't be a total state from which the next state follows. But in the free will debate, metaphysical determinism continues to be discussed as a thesis that at any moment in time, given the total state of the universe and the total set of laws, there's only one possible future. In the free will debate, we talk about causation, but in fundamental physics, it seems that the notion of causation just disappears or turns into something sort of incomprehensibly different, and it's not clear what time is supposed to be. So it might be that our notion of causation, in fact, has its central home in the notion of agency, in the doing and bringing about and manipulation and intervening that agency involves, rather than in physics. And this is, there are some philosophers working on causation who argue this, including possibly Whitehead, if I understood him. Okay, so there aren't agreed accounts of causality or laws in terms of which we can even really state the questions we're concerned with. But I think we can motivate a puzzle about agency at an intuitive level without settling these questions. And this puzzle, I think, can be presented without thinking that humans are some kind of exception to the natural order. It's one of the concerns about views of free will that aren't compatibilist, that they make humans an exception to the natural order. Because I think it applies to other animals as well. So what I'm calling an antinomy of agency concerns two ways of thinking about agency, both of which we naturally operate with, and both of which I think are required to understand agency, but which seem to be in tension with each other. So we can use the word agency in a lot of different ways, but I'm going to use it from now on in this talk specifically to refer to a kind of causal capacity that some things in the world have, subject agents with a point of view, goals and desires, and the ability to move themselves as a whole, to move themselves in a relatively centralized way from their subjective point of view in pursuing their goals. Okay, so these kinds of agents, as the ones we know about, are biological organisms that have a relatively centralized capacity to move their bodies and a subjective point of view from which they act to realize their goals or purposes. I'm not ruling out the possibility of other kinds of self-moving things or forms of collective agency. I'm just interested in understanding these kinds of agents. So acting is doing something, bringing it about that something happens or doesn't happen, settling what happens. This is surely the evolutionary advantage that agency gives organisms. Agency gives living things flexibility and versatility in exploiting possibilities in changing and relatively unpredictable environments through being able to move themselves around and do one thing or another. And I think this means that the notion of agency includes the idea that with respect to the agent, the future is in some ways open. When we think of animals as moving themselves, as acting, we think about them as able to do one thing or another at the time at which they act. The self-moving biological agents that we know are things that have a subjectivity, a point of view on the world from which they act. And their agency involves purposes and goals. I'm not resting anything on whether you think particular words like knowledge or goal should be used in relation to animals. I'm just assuming that they have minds, that they have perceptual states, that they have things that they're doing or trying to do that need to be understood from the point of view of their minds. So agency is teleological. Teleology is a bad word in some empiricist contexts. It's thought to indicate pre-Darwinian views of nature as a whole as having purposes or expressing some other agent's purposes. And it's also a bad word in some post-Enlightenment contexts where it's thought to indicate an over-optimistic view of human progress. But it doesn't need to involve either of those. We don't need the idea that nature has purposes, and we don't need to resolve all debates in philosophy of biology about exactly how teleology features there or whether it's different to teleonomy. We just need the idea that there are biological creatures whose actions we understand in relation to understanding their purposes and goals. With respect to other animals, we might not understand these very well. We're often just making informed guesses. But when we think of an animal as acting, as doing something, we understand it as doing something that has a purpose. And understanding this includes requiring understanding, to some degree, the animal's subjective point of view, or at least that it has one. Why are the elephants moving down the hill? They want to drink at the waterhole. Animals exist in complex changing environments in which they have to move their bodies in different ways in relation to the environment to bring about their purposes. So philosophers sometimes use the word intentional agency to refer to agents who act for articulable reasons, but I take it that animal agency is intentional in the sense that it has to be understood in relation to the animal's subjective conscious point of view from which it's doing things. So there are all sorts of things to which we can take an intentional stance, but agents, I think, are things to which you need to take an intentional stance. So I take it that thinking of animals as agents involves thinking of them as fundamentally different from machines, at least the machines we know, because the movement of a machine can be explained in terms of the movements of its parts. So the washing machine moves, but it doesn't move itself. When we think of an animal as acting, we think of it as moving itself. And this involves a kind of capacity that the washing machine lacks. The animal moves itself as a whole. So animals move themselves, have a subjective point of view, have something like purposes and goals, and act in the world. I think these are completely natural thoughts and things I think we believe. Agency, of course, isn't magic. Embodied biological agents act through causal processes happening in their parts and subsystems, and we're rapidly learning more about how this works. And these explanations involve showing how states of things have to follow from previous states of things. When this part of the subsystem is like this is what has to happen. And every time an animal acts, things are happening inside it that can be explained in this way. So I take it to be a constraint on a naturalistic account of agency to think that when agents bring things about in the world, they don't break the laws governing their parts in order to do this, and they don't break the laws governing the chemicals and molecules and atoms and fermions and bosons that make up their parts and subsystems. So the idea of gaps in the laws into which agency would somehow be inserted, or the idea that agency involves breaking the laws, seems to involve something non-natural and also seems to be completely unhelpful. It doesn't contribute anything to understanding how agency works. Rather, the laws governing the parts and subsystems give us insight into how animals are able to act in the world. So we've got two very different ways of thinking about and explaining what's happening when an animal acts. One kind of explanation involves the parts of the animal. The other involves the animal as a whole, i.e. the animal. One kind of explanation involves showing how what happens follows from past states. The other appeals to future purposes that can be pursued in relatively open-ended ways. And one kind of explanation involves showing how what happens has to happen, or happens with some probability, while the other sees what happens as relatively open and is settled by what the animal does. And these two ways of thinking about agency seem to be in tension with each other. I think they threaten to exclude each other, but we're committed to both. So that's what I'm calling an antinomy of agency. So I take this to bring out two things about agency that we need to accommodate. On the one hand, the idea of the conscious point of view from which the agent acts to bring about their purposes is essential to the idea of agency. It's not epiphenomenal. It's central to what agency is, doing something to bring about some purpose. On the other hand, agency is entirely embodied and doesn't require gaps in the laws governing the parts of the agent at different levels. So an antinomy for Kant is a pair of two contradictory claims for which we have equally good arguments. And like in Kant's antinomy about freedom, in this antinomy of agency, we seem to have two different kinds of causality, both of which we ordinarily take to do explanatory work, but which seem to exclude each other, or threaten to exclude each other. If there aren't explanations at the level of the parts and subparts of the animal, agency seems to be magic, it doesn't seem to be embodied, and it seems to require breaking laws. But if what's happening to the parts of the agent's body bring about what happens next, definitely or with some probability, what happens is not really up to the animal. The animal is not really acting, it's just a locus where some of the unavoidable or random happenings in the world are occurring, and there's nothing left for the animal to do. Rather than explaining agency, we've explained it away. Of course, lots of philosophers and philosophical interpretations of science are completely happy to say that the idea of agents is just a convenient but fictional shorthand grounded in convenience and epistemic limitations. Less drastically, you might think that complete part-whole explanations of the movements of animals' bodies aren't a threat to the idea of animal agency. Now, there's a sense in which I agree with this. We don't need these explanations to be incomplete in the sense that there are gaps in them. But I want to insist that there is real explanatory work for understanding of agency at the level of the point of view from which the animal moves themselves as a whole. This is not merely a convenient viewpoint on something that could entirely be made sense of without it, but a real feature of the natural world that plays its own part in the unfolding of what happens. There are happenings that can't be entirely understood without understanding that agents brought things about. Okay, so given the dominance of standard compatibilist views in philosophy, I probably need to say more to motivate the claim that we lose the idea of agency if we lose the idea of the animal moving itself in a centralized way, and we lose the idea that it's up to the animal to do one thing or another, that is the point of agency. And I'll try to say a little bit more later, but I want to start just by sketching an alternative picture. Because I think that part of what makes the standard compatibilist view seem appealing is thinking that it's the only way to take seriously the science about parts and microparts. So even if you don't think that there's a genuine antinomy, I'm asking you to consider it provisionally, because allowing the antinomy provisionally and seeing how it might be solved motivates the possibility of a kind of agency that means you don't need standard compatibilism. So there's an enormous literature about human action in which philosophers propose that we can distinguish between mere happenings in an agent's body and actions by picking out as actions those movements of the body that are caused by the right kinds of mental states in the right way. We can understand this, I think, in terms of wanting to do justice to both sides of my antinomy. We want to do justice to the idea that agency essentially involves the agent's mental states, what the person is trying to do. But we also want to do justice to the idea that agency is a causal notion, and that embodied agency must involve things happening in agents' bodies. So, if we just say that the mental states essential to understanding agency from the agent's points of view are also the event causes of movements of the agent's body, we seem to have incorporated both perspectives. But I think we seem to do so only because we hover between two different kinds of explanation, alternatively focusing on the relevant mental states from each point of view, and just assuming or declaring that they could somehow play both roles. When we're thinking about the intentional states that make sense of actions from the agent's point of view, the content of these states is essential, as well as perhaps normative relations between such contents. And these contents don't look like event causes. If we hand-wavingly assume that all the really real causation is done by the physical realizers of the contentful states, then we're abandoning the idea that the content of the states plays a role in explaining how and why the action happened, which is abandoning agency, in my view. And there are lots of well-known problems with these views, with thinking about our beliefs and desires as causes of action. There are problems with deviant causal chains and disappearing agents. But the alternatives also seem problematic. Weird agent-causal acts of volition that are unconnected to the preceding order. And I think we can see this as an illustration of pressure from two different ways of thinking about agency. We want there to be event-causal explanations at the level of the parts or states of the agent. And we want the representational states that make sense of the bringing about of the action from the agent's point of view. And I take the challenge to be to understand how to do justice to both sides of these explanations and how they relate to each other. Because the role mental states play in explaining action from the agent's point of view involves their content, one tempting solution for human agency is to allocate reasons explanations to a non-causal realm of normative connections, which might make it easier to think that there's no clash between these two different kinds of explanation. But thinking about other animals makes this considerably less tempting. The conscious point of view from which the animal has goals and purposes and acts to bring about their purposes is an essential part of what it is for them to be acting, and surely something that needs to be understood as part of their agency as a causal notion, not in some non-causal space of reasons. Kant has two antinomies in the vicinity of this antinomy. The third antinomy in the Critique of Pure Reason concerns two different notions of causality that he thinks threaten to exclude each other, but both play a role in our thinking about the world: the causality of nature and the causality of freedom. And in his antinomy of teleological judgment, in the third critique, he thinks that, on the one hand, we explain the properties of things in terms of properties of their parts at smaller and smaller levels. But on the other hand, we can't understand anything as an organism without thinking that the functioning of the parts has to be understood at least partly in relation to the whole. Now, science has changed a lot since Kant's time. In many ways, I think the problem should seem worse for him than it seems to us now. We know so much more about biology and complexity than 17th century physics. But I think there's something helpful about the thoughts that drive both of his antinomies. There's something we find compelling about explanations that show how states of the world follow from previous states with no gaps in the causal order. And there's something we find compelling about explanations that show how things' properties can be explained in terms of the properties of their parts. And I think these kind of explanations play a role in making agency and free agency seem puzzling or impossible. So the neuropsychologist, I think, Robert Sapolsky, has got this book where he argues that brain science shows free will to be impossible. And philosophers don't like the book because he dismisses standard compatibilism, but I think that's fine. But the kinds of explanations he appeals to are entirely these two forms of explanations that Kant is interested in. Explanations that explain things in terms of properties of the parts, and explanations that show how things follow from previous states. So I think these forms of explanation that he's puzzled by do still really play a role in our thinking. Kant's solution to the third antinomy aims merely to show that the causality of freedom is possible, or strictly speaking, not impossible. And in the free will debate, this is often thought to be a completely inadequate strategy. If what's at issue is the kind of responsibility that justifies people being punished, showing that it's not logically impossible that they had the requisite capacities doesn't seem compelling. But if you're setting aside thoughts about punishment, which raises its own complications, I understand Kant's strategy in terms of the following way of thinking about the problem. The starting point is that we believe in agency and free will. We recognize moral reasons. I should do this, I shouldn't do that. In recognizing such reasons, we understand ourselves and each other as able to act in response to them, to act or to not act. The free will problem arises because the way we think about science and the metaphysics we take ourselves to need to make sense of science seems to threaten the possibility of this kind of agency, and our task is to ward off the threat. So our task is to show that nothing about the way we understand science philosophically shows that the agency we already believe in is impossible. So our situation is not one in which we start with no idea at all whether or not they're free agents. We're looking for reasons to come to a judgment on the balance of probabilities. We already believe in free agents. If we can show that this belief is not ruled out by the philosophical thoughts we take to follow from science, we can proceed as we were with the beliefs we already had. And my thinking about agency is going to follow roughly this approach. So I think that we, and that's we animal observers, bird watchers, pet guardians, wildlife documentary makers and viewers, homeowners dealing with pests, hunters, game rangers, biologists, we believe in animal agents. We engage with and understand animals as creatures that move themselves in relation to their purposes, and we see them as having a conscious subjective points of view from which ways of realizing their purposes are salient to them. A central way we think about the scientific explanations of the movements of animals' bodies and the metaphysics we take to make sense of these explanations seems to threaten the idea that there could be agents in this sense. If we can show that we don't need to take the science in that way, we can ward off the threat, and we'll be where we were, believing in agents. So this has implications for the limits of my ambitions. I'm not attempting to work out a metaphysics of agency or of causation, certainly not of the laws of nature or of emergence. I've got the dramatically more limited aim of arguing that the causality of animal agency is possible. So I want to understand the possibility of the causality of agency as a genuine, irreducible, whole-part causality that can bring about happenings in the world. I also want to give some reasons for thinking that it's empirically plausible and that there are no a priori reasons to rule it out. So I take it that for it to be possible that the complete picture of the unfolding of the world requires understanding things that animals do, it needs to be the case that the micro-laws governing the parts of animals are compatible with more than one thing happening at other levels. One way you might put that would be to say that lower-level laws don't give a complete account of what's going on. But that's liable to be misleading, the problematic ways of hearing it. It could be heard as saying that there are gaps in our knowledge about the lower-level laws, or that the laws aren't fully precise, that they leave open what follows from them, or worse, that there are atoms that don't obey the laws governing atoms. And none of these are helpful or necessary. We don't need any of those thoughts. Rather, I think the sense of incompleteness we need is just the thought that the particular laws describing interactions of matter at some particular level, whether it's macroscopic mechanics or molecular bonding or fermions and bosons, are not the only explanation of what's happening. Higher level properties of structures into which parts are formed also play a role in how a system unfolds. So Nancy Cartwright points out that we don't have any actual examples of known laws of nature that operate without ceteris paribus clauses. What I take her to mean from this is not that the laws are imprecise, that they give incomplete predictions, or that they leave things open in terms of the law, but just that the laws tell us what follows from the sources of motion they describe or govern, and they don't tell us that these are the only sources of motion. So Cartwright says, why are there things that happen that don't follow Newton's laws? There are sources of motion not mentioned in the laws. So Cartwright points out that known laws typically make precise predictions only in precisely controlled conditions, in which other factors have been excluded. And this is difficult. That's why experiments are difficult and expensive. You have to exclude all these other possible forces. So philosophers who object to accounts of free agency that see it as incompatible with metaphysical determinism commonly argue that such accounts should lead us to expect to see deviations from what the laws predict. But most of the time, in the situations we're actually in, we have absolutely no idea at all what the fundamental laws of physics predict. What do the fundamental laws of physics lead you to predict follows from the current state of all the bosons and fermions in this room right now? Now, you'll think that that's just an epistemic point and that there is, in fact, something that has to happen from the current state of the bosons and fermions in this room, and I'll come back to that. But for now, I just want to note that we shouldn't give standard compatibilism more naturalistic credibility than it's due by imagining that we actually have expectations about what the laws of fundamental physics predict in the actual situations in which animals and humans act. Nancy Cartwright makes a whole lot of further claims about the nature of laws and their place in nature. She thinks that nature isn't best understood as governed by laws and that the world is significantly disunified, but we don't need any of those further claims. We just need the more minimal point that laws make predictions concerning the properties described or governed by the laws, but don't say anything about whether or not those are the only properties that are relevant to what's happening in the total system. So when we're evaluating what laws predict and whether or not they seem to have been broken, we mustn't confuse two different situations. One is a situation in which the only sources of change in the world are those covered by some particular set of laws, and the laws predict precisely what will happen. And another is a situation in which there are other sources of change in operation. In the second situation, something may happen which is not what the laws would have predicted in the situation in which only the laws were in operation and there were no other sources of motion. But this doesn't mean the laws were broken. It just means we were in a different situation than the idealization in which the laws are normally understood. So laws that govern or describe sources of change in open systems containing other sources of change don't have the same predictions that they would have if they were governing or describing closed systems in which they were the only sources of change. Philosophers talk about the possibly metaphorical idea of different levels of explanation. So they talk about top-down causation or whole-part causation. The standard example of whole-part causation is a moving wheel. So there are laws governing the molecules in the substance that a wheel is made up of, but it might be that if you want to understand where all the molecules are going right now, you need to appeal to the movement of the wheel and not the laws governing the molecular bonding. But that doesn't mean, of course, that the laws governing the molecular bonding get broken, or that they've got gaps in them, or that they're not precise. It just means that the laws governing the molecular bonding are compatible with more than one thing happening to the macroscopic object that the molecules are making up, which is presumably a good thing if you want to make wheels that can enable you to get to different places. Our understanding of the molecular properties of the substances that can make up wheels enables us to understand why and how we can make wheels from some substances and not from others. And these different substances with their different properties are all made from the same micro-constituents at the level of fermions and bosons. And the way the fermions and bosons are combined into atoms and molecules and the way the molecules are combined results in different configurations with different properties and allows the creation of further configurations and structures. The molecular laws that explain the properties of a particular metal constrain but don't determine the shapes into which we can make it. They allow us to form it into a variety of possible shapes and put these together in complex structures, enabling new things that we can do with them, which is what we want from machines. So we've got explanation going in different directions here. On the one hand, explanations concerning molecular bonding enable us to understand constraints on what we can build out of particular substances. On the other hand, higher-level explanations about the creation of structures enables us to understand new possibilities for doing things that the structures explain. We don't have to say that this is just that these different levels of explanation are just convenient because we can't see everything that's happening at the molecular level. Rather, I take it that only appealing to the laws of molecular bonding leaves something unexplained. Why, given only their molecular bonding, are all the particles rushing along like this? What's happening is consistent with the laws of molecular bonding, but in the terms of the laws, it's just a massively unexplained coincidence. The thought is that to understand what's happening, the flows of energy in the system, you need to understand the molecular bonding and also the role played by higher level configurations in the unfolding of the system. And lots of discussion in evolutionary biology aims also talk about new possibilities for motion and action that new structures give creatures. What new things can fish do when they acquire a jaw? The first ones didn't have jaws, and there are fewer things they could do. There are completely new kinds of movements that are opened up when you get a skeleton. These kinds of explanations don't typically involve showing how certain movements have to follow, given the way the parts of a creature are put together. On the contrary, they give us an account of the possibilities for open-ended action enabled by the way the stuff the creature is made of is put together. Once creatures get rid of a shell, there are new kinds of ways they're able to move, also new kinds of defenses they need. So the explanations typically give us an account of new degrees of freedom and control achieved by some level of structure and organization. We've got increasing understandings of the kinds of organization and structure that enable living things to maintain and organize themselves. And again, we don't have to think of the self-organizing principles of a cell as a mysterious vitalist force that inserts itself into the causality of a physical system. We just need the idea that new organization creates new possibilities. The new organization structures, governs, or constrains what's happening at the molecular level, just as the laws governing the molecular parts constrain the possibilities for building cells. Once evolution gets to multicellular organisms, there are more and more complex possibilities for action and more things the creature needs to be able to do. So a common strategy evolution pursues for living things to exploit possibilities in their environments is the development of a central nervous system that enables creatures to control their bodies centrally, to move as a whole, and to have a subjectivity, to perceive the world and themselves. So all living things have internal systems that encode information about their environment. Plants and bacteria do that. But for many living things, we don't need to think of this information in terms of subjective experience. So, of course, lots of complexities and borderline cases, but broadly speaking, the creatures for whom it becomes plausible that they have subjective experience are also the ones who have the ability to move themselves as a whole. The development of agency and the development of subjectivity come together. And this shouldn't be surprising. A creature that's moving itself around needs to know where it is and what's around it, whether what's around it is food or foe, what's its body and what's not its body, what way up it is. There's nothing non-naturalistic about the idea that action requires subjectivity and perception, and we have increasing understanding of the complex centralized structures and feedback systems that make this possible. So we don't have to solve the mind-body problem to take seriously the idea that there are animals with minds, and their minds play a role in their natures. Most obviously, they're acting. This is just taking seriously the idea that minds are natural. But to gesture in the direction of the mind-body problem, consciousness is an expensive strategy. So naturalistically speaking, it seems reasonable to assume that it's not epiphenomenal. It's got a naturalistically explanatory role. Animals exist in changing environments in which there are usually multiple goals and multiple options for action. Regulating movement and behavior through a set of causal triggers, like maybe bacteria do, has got very limited flexibility. It doesn't seem to me surprising that an effective and efficient possibilities for action are opened up by an animal's having centralized awareness of itself and its situation, from which it can evaluate its state, its various needs, current affordances and dangers, and respond flexibly. So as I see it, rejecting dualism doesn't mean thinking that all the really real explanation takes place at the level of the microparts described by physical theories. I think that's actually accepting dualism. It involves thinking of mind as something essentially different from the natural world. It's Cartesian materialism. I think that rejecting dualism means taking seriously that consciousness is a real feature of some natural systems that operates as a kind of structuring cause, enabling kinds of organization and movement that atoms on their own don't have. If we think about it in this way, we don't need to take understanding the causality of agency to be a question of finding the right kind of mental state event cause of bodily movements. whether it's a cause that is determined or random or non-natural. Rather than looking for some kind of initial event-causal trigger that starts a cascade of bodily movements, we can see agency as a kind of high-level control a natural system has of itself. And it's not that we need an event with no causal antecedents. We need a higher-level causal capacity to shape what happens in different ways that's compatible with the constraints provided by the causal antecedents. Now, standard compatibilists, of course, like to appeal to control. I think they help themselves to the idea that there is any kind of agential control in a metaphysically determined system. So John Martin Fisher says, even if determinism means that he was only ever going to turn his car to the left, it could still be the case that he smoothly controls the steering of the wheel as he turns to the left. But acting is never just one thing being caused to start and then the bodily motions just unfolding with no further requirements from the agent. Our ordinary understanding of such smooth agential control involves the ability to respond to lots of different things that can happen, constantly making micro-adjustments in relation to changes, as any beginner driver discovers. Someone who has this agential ability could have responded to all sorts of different things that could have happened. Bumps in the road, pedestrians to avoid, and they don't have this ability unless that's true of them. So there are alternative possibilities throughout the process of an action unfolding, and an animal is in control of their moving their bodies throughout the process of an action unfolding. So we don't need to think of the animal as having mental states that are event causes of its bodily motions, but rather as having a conscious subjective point of view from which it moves itself. This is something animals have to do all the time they're awake. It's their existential condition. They have to control the whole process of their actions unfolding, responding to different things that happen and changes in affordances, dangers, and their own state. The point of this control is to enable the animal to respond flexibly to different things that happen in an unpredictable world. So on this account, the high-level conscious control through which the animal moves its body is part of what explains what's happening to its parts, just as the way the parts are made and the laws governing them constrain, but also make possible, the creature's possibilities for motion. And this can be a real part of the unfolding of the world. But you might think there's something special about the micro-level laws. Everything is made up of parts, microparts, governed by the laws of fundamental physics. So maybe there's some way in which all the properties that the structures have at every other level just has to follow from the micro laws. And another thought you might have is that there is some total set of laws governing or describing all the configurations there can be, and from these we can see how whatever happens has to happen. I think it's worth asking what the empirical or a priori status of either of those claims is supposed to be. But you might think, well, because complex things like living organisms arose later in the development of the universe, their arising must follow from the micro laws governing the stuff from which they arose. So maybe this means that there must be a complete explanation at the level of the microparts from which everything that subsequently develops can be derived. In what sense of derived? Of course, everything that subsequently develops must be compatible with the lower level laws, but does it have to be necessitated by the lower level laws on their own? Normally people are quite pleased to have an explanation of how the forms of life we see around us could have arisen from the properties of matter, rather than thinking we would only have an explanation of life if we get one that shows how life had to arise in exactly the forms that it did. Suppose the microtheory allows some unpredictability, as our current theories do, both at the quantum level and at the level of random mutation in biology. Perhaps this results in things beginning to combine in new ways to form more complex structures that can do new things. But perhaps this happens even without unpredictability. Perhaps fundamental laws of physics deterministically result in the existence of compounds and structures with new properties. Why think that once there are new structures, their properties are still, in some sense, nothing more than the properties of the microparts of the substances making up the new structures? why not think it's at least possible that without any changes to the properties of the microparts, the structures in which they are put together can do new things? So it seems at least possible that understanding the properties of matter is not merely a matter of understanding how the micro-constituents behave on their own, but also what happens when they combine in various ways and the new structures this can bring into being. Once complex forms of matter arise and then life, they affect the world in new ways, and the world and its lower level laws affect them. So life brings about changes in the levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide, and these bring about changes and new possibilities for life, for the development of new life forms. And once this gets going, you might expect to see a complex world with lots of different kinds of properties and systems, and interaction between properties described at different levels. And in such a world, I don't think we would expect the complete unfolding of the world to follow only from laws describing the properties at some particular level of description. And that seems to be the world we encounter. So there's a way of thinking about physics from which the reductive perspective might seem mandatory. If we take the laws of fundamental physics and think of them as applying to a closed system in the sense that there is nothing else that explains what's happening in the system. Thinking that we can give empirical content to the idea of the universe as a whole, as a closed system, is one of Kant's targets in his critique of rationalistic empiricism. He thinks that to cognize the world as a whole, as a totality, you would have to have knowledge of all the states of the world, and also to know that these are all the states of the world, and that this is something that goes beyond any possible experience or empirical knowledge. There isn't a way of cognizing the world empirically that steps out of particular human experiences and cognizes the world as a totality. We aim to think about the world from no point of view, and this is something we can get closer to and we can approximate, but we can't get all the way there. When we try to, we lose contact with something given in experience. So the idea loses empirical content. So we shouldn't mistake idealizations that have explanatory power, because of course science uses idealizations and they do explain things, but we shouldn't mistake them for empirical claims about the structure of reality, never mind for claims about the necessary structure of reality. And I take it that the actual practice of science fits this. Actual science doesn't study the world as a whole, it studies open subsystems of the world. But you might think this is just an epistemic point. You might think there must be a sense in which the world does exist as a total system. If God could see the world from outside of space-time, God would be able to see an explanation for everything that happens. Which is a sort of not obvious thing for an empiricist to think, since it sounds like a rationalist principle of sufficient reason. But why not think that what God would see could include bosons and fermions combining to create new properties and structures with new properties, and these combining to create new structures and properties, including physical systems whose complex organization and feedback properties enable them to maintain themselves as dynamic persisting structures, to sense the world and themselves so that they can move themselves centrally from their point of view, resulting in new things happening in the world. Kant has some thoughts about why we so easily get in the grip of a reductive picture that assumes that the causal properties of the complex and varied things we encounter in a complex world are really just the properties of the microparts. Because he thinks that there's something we just find particularly compelling about empirical explanations that show how states of things are necessitated by previous states, as well as empirical explanations that explain the properties of things in terms of the properties of their parts. When we understand how the properties of a thing follows from the properties of its parts, we have a certain kind of satisfying insight or comprehension into it. One way of thinking about this is that we understand how we could make it, or we understand why it has to be the way it is. And this is a form of explanation that's particularly satisfying to us. It's what the rationalist principle of sufficient reason is looking for, an understanding of why something has to be the way it is. Kant argues that the only legitimate empirical employment of the principle of sufficient reason is as a regulative idea. We want to have explanations of why things have to be the way they are, and we should keep looking for such explanations. The kinds of explanations we find satisfying lead us to pose these questions in iterative ways, explaining the properties of parts of things at finer and finer grained levels, the properties of the parts of the parts and the parts of the parts and the causes of the causes. So we seek further explanation as long as there's something left unexplained, and this is a good thing, it drives science. But does it follow that there must be all the explanations that we're seeking for? Are we entitled to assert that the structure of reality has to be such as to match the kind of explanations we find maximally satisfying? Kant, in fact, thinks that there are a priori reasons to think that we can't reach the complete reductive explanations that we want. Our search for the iterative explanations of the kind of explanations that we find satisfying leads us to seek complete explanations of a sort we could only get by arriving at something that doesn't require further explanation. And this couldn't be something contingent. So our explanatory ambitions at an empirical level run up against limits. Unless the fundamental laws of physics are logically necessary, it seems that discovering them will leave a why question unanswered. Yeah, but even if you don't find all these further Kantian thoughts compelling, there's still a question about the empirical justification for taking the fundamental laws of physics to apply to a system closed under those laws, in which we know the state of all the initial particles, in the sense that the laws governing matter at the micro level are the only things that explain the causal unfolding of the world. And there's also a question of the a priori status of the claims that part-whole explanations and past-present causal explanations are the only legitimate ones. So I think that taking science seriously, the way we explain the world in science, and in particular the scientific explanations we have of states of parts of agents' bodies and the role these play in animal movements, doesn't show that we can't think of animals as moving themselves in relatively open-ended ways that play a real explanatory role in the unfolding and happenings in the world. So this antinomy that I've presented about agency arises before we get to free agency. And I think it shifts the way we think about free agency and the metaphysics of the free will debate. If the causality of agency is incompatible with determinism, it could make some parts of the free will debate seem more tractable. The causality of agency that we need for free agency doesn't need to be seen as a non-natural causal power involving panicky metaphysics that separates us from nature. We also don't need to locate the causality in particular mental states, the having of which can be understood as efficient causes of bodily movements. And we don't need an event with no causal antecedents. We need a higher level capacity to shape what happens in different ways that's compatible with the constraints provided by the causal antecedents. So the whole action unfolds from the point of view of the animal's purposes and its control over its body. But on the other hand, showing that the causality of agency is possible is not enough to explain the free and responsible agency often taken to be at issue in the free will debate, because other animals' actions are a function of their natures. They're not responsible for their natures, and their natures don't give them the capacity to reflect on the choice-worthiness of their instincts and desires, or the capacity to choose on to reflect on the choice-worthiness of the means they're taking to their desires, and whether or not to act on them. Animals that can be held responsible for their agency would need cognitive capacities that enable them to reflect on the choice-worthiness of their inclinations, desires, and means, and to choose in the light of this deliberation. That's another story.
Okay, so we have our usual hand-finger system. If you have a new question, please raise your hand. If you have a follow-up, please raise your finger. I'll do my best to keep the queue moving along. And just to get things started, I want to see if I can start with a graduate student. Flo, why don't we start with you? And then everybody who wants to ask a question, please keep your hand up. And in the meantime, Flo, just hang on.
Hello. Thank you for the talk. So I have questions concerning the respects in which view is not a compatibilist one. So, but to be clear first, I want to get clear on the metaphysical commitments you think are compatible with the existence of agency. So would you be willing to grant that for every closed system, there exists laws such that from its current microphysical properties, we can predict any later microphysical properties, and so forgetting about any other properties?
A system that is closed in the sense that those laws are the only things going on.
In the sense that it's isolated from causal interaction with anything outside of the system.
There are no other causes in that system. The only causes in that system are the ones described by those laws.
Yeah, we can assume we have the correct laws. But I'm asking...
I'm not doubting whether the laws are correct or not. I'm doubting whether they are the only things happening in the system. So if there are molecules as well as atoms, then I think it can't be closed under the laws of the atoms. So I'm happy for it to be closed under just the one, it's the beginning of the universe and there's only bosons and fermions or whatever there was. Yeah, does that...
So I just want to be, I'll clarify my question a bit.
Okay.
So the following proposition, suppose we have a system that is closed in the sense that it is isolated from causal interaction with outside sources. Would it be compatible with the existence of agency that for every such system, there exists microphysical laws such that any later microphysical properties can be predicted by those laws from the current microphysical properties?
In that system?
Yes.
So I think, I don't know whether it could be possible. I don't really know how to think about the world as a whole as closed, but suppose there's some sense in which the world as a whole is closed, and suppose you can start with microphysical properties from which other things follow. If new structures can arise from those microphysical laws, and from those new structures can arise, then I think agency could arise. But then I also think that everything wouldn't be predicted from the microphysical laws alone.
Right. So I'm just asking about whether the microphysical properties can be predicted.
In a system that's closed completely under those, I would have thought so, yeah.
Okay, good.
But then I think you wouldn't have agency.
Oh, okay, so the answer is no, it wouldn't be compatible with your own agency that there could be a closed system from which later microphysical properties are predictable from earlier microphysical properties.
Yes.
Okay. Oh, then it sounds like your view, or the existence of agency would make implications, empirical implications, even if we restrict ourselves to finite closed systems and only looking at physical properties.
But I don't think there are closed systems in the world. So I don't think it has actual...
Okay.
Okay.
So I'm sorry, I might not have got you. We could talk later if I didn't get you properly.
Salam.
Thanks for the talk. I found it very compelling, although now with your response to Flo, I'm not sure if I kind of understood the points of view you're coming from. So, I mean, I held the view, or I understood what you were saying as, well, you could have basically a system, like, I guess the world as a whole, the universe, whatever you want to call it, in which, you could give a complete microphysical description of what happens, like, in terms of like microphysical properties and like microphysical laws. But you could also give, a description in which like, agency kind of functions to explain why agents do things, but in a way which is kind of compatible with also describing the world in these terms. But it seems like you're not saying that. Like you're saying that there has to be this kind of openness, like at the microphysical level, in order for agency to be like a real possibility. Is that correct?
So maybe I just confused things in my previous answer. What I don't want to say, so there could be a complete microphysical description. So it's not that there are any gaps in the microphysical description. The question is whether the microphysical description is enough to tell you what's happening and why. Whether it's, and whether what can happen and how things unfold is constrained, is completely predicted or determined by the microphysical states. So I'm not denying that you could have a complete microphysical description, but I'm denying that it could give you an account of everything that happens in the world. And I'm also denying that what happens is determined by what happens at by the complete microphysical state. It's constrained by it. But more than one thing can happen.
Then in what sense is it complete?
So when you're moving a wheel, there are no gaps in the laws explaining the molecular bonding. But the laws governing the molecular bonding don't explain why the wheel is moving or why all the molecules are going where they're going. So they're complete. There are no gaps at the level of molecular bonding. It's not that the moving force of the wheel sort of inserts itself into a gap in the molecular bonding. Those are just fine. They're just explaining everything about why the molecules are bonded the way they are, but they're not explaining everything that's happening in the system, and they're compatible with different things happening in the system.
Okay.
That's the idea.
Hey, Lucy, thanks for the talk. This is just a clarification from something Sloan was saying. Do you want to say at the higher level something can happen or something can be happening? And those two things sound very different. And maybe we have to wait till tomorrow's lecture to get the free piece in. But it looks like on one way of understanding it, we've got the complete microphysical description. And there are different ways of understanding what's happening at a higher level. Sounds like a weaker claim to have than different things could happen. That's the thing that looks like we need the gappiness.
I think both. And I don't think you need gaps for different things to be able to happen. Okay. So the wheel can go in different directions. Of course, the wheel isn't going to do anything on its own. But once you get a living thing, in fact, I think it just might even be true of just a cell. That once you've now got a relatively causally insulated thing that has got new causal powers in the world that can do one thing or another, and the micro level laws are not. It's not just a different level of description that we need because we need different levels of description. It's that really something different can happen.
And will there be downward explanation? That change in the upward and the higher level, that's going to be required to explain something at the lower level, because that's going to make it look incomplete.
It's not, well, it would make it look incomplete. I think we think it looks incomplete because we're comparing two different cases. So we're comparing the case in which there weren't any higher level explanations going on and the molecules were just doing what they were doing, with the case in which there are other things going on. And so now the cell is doing something with the molecules. So now something else is happening. But that doesn't mean that when nothing else was happening, the molecules wouldn't have unfolded the way they did. So they're not complete, but something else is now happening.
Great,
that's
thanks.
the idea.
I was wondering about the relationship between the two types, or what seemed to be like two types of causation in your picture. So one is the sort of causality of agency, and the other is the type of causation that presumably is happening at the microphysical level. Sometimes it seemed like those were sort of supposed to be like of the same genus or something. And then at other times, you spoke about them in ways that made me think that actually they were like really different, right? So one can be aimed in multiple directions. The other one is associated with by a sort of like law-governed constraint. And so I guess I was just trying to like get clear on like, how am I supposed to think about just like the relationship between the types of causation is at issue there?
So it's a great question, but I don't know if I can fully answer it because I don't know. It's really hard, and I don't really know enough about causation in science. But as far as I can tell, in fundamental physics, people just started even talking about causation. So maybe the notion of causation only really comes in properly when you get life. And you get things that actually, now you've got bosons and fermions and atoms and molecules and things that they're all just doing. I don't know if they're not really doing, they're just being. But now you've got configurations that are self-organizing and dynamic and maintaining and persisting and drawing into sources of energy and doing one thing or another. And maybe that is where we should locate causation. So I'm not totally sure how to think about that question, because I'm not totally sure how to think about causation in the, well, really in either level, but particularly in the science level.
Thank you.
Especially in the fundamental physics.
Zoe.
Thanks so much, Lucy. I am wondering what you think about group agency, often discussed especially in relation to free will and responsibility. Because there are some parts of the account that look like they'll extend really readily. After all, what is a group if not a structure that enables new possibilities for doing things? But there are other parts that really don't look like they will extend. Like if I consider an academic department, it doesn't have subjective experiences. So in that respect, it's more like a plant than a human or an animal. There's no literal sense in which it moves itself because it doesn't have a body. But surely a department can do things. And I'm sort of struggling to have an intuition about whether it can do things in relatively open-ended ways. I'm like asking myself the question, does that seem intuitive or not? And I'm drawing a blank. So yeah, what do you think?
So I haven't worked out thoughts about group agency at all, but I do think that group agency is a possibility. And I think what makes it a possibility is it's going to obviously be different from biological organisms precisely because it doesn't have a unified conscious point of view from which it moves itself as a whole.
Exactly.
So
yeah, those
that's a big difference. But there is a unified deliberative point of view. And that, I think, is what makes it possible for artificial persons and corporations and university departments to potentially act. So I think you need some kind of unified deliberative point of view from which things issue.
Yeah. Could you say a bit more about what a point of view is?
Possibly not.
All right. Thank you.
I think I would just want to say, like, starting from, like literally you're looking at the world right now from the point of view of a unified consciousness. No, but so I don't have enough thoughts about different kinds of collective agents that they could be. I have some thoughts about artificial persons when it comes to states and corporations. I don't know if they would all need to be constituted as a unified deliberative point of view in the same way, or they just need a possibility of acting, like a state does things that can be imputed to it, and in that sense it's an artificial person. So I don't really have enough specific thoughts about what would constitute different kinds of collective agents. If I were to start trying to say what a unified point of view was, I would start thinking about just the unified, literally the unity of consciousness, and so you have a unified perceptual point of view of the world, but also a unified point of view on thinking about the world and thinking about your options. And the department comes together and deliberates and votes, and is that how it represents its unified point of view? Maybe. I haven't really thought about those things enough, but it's good things to think about.
Thank you very much. My question was somewhat with group agency as well, but my examples as a biologist were from, for example, your herbivorous grazing animals there. As a group, how does that relate to agency? And at the lower level, you also touched on this somewhat, but didn't use the word agency. In terms of cells, for example, giving up autonomy in order to, and as a result, forming a multicellular organism, either in development as a result of so-called environmental changes or over evolution as a result of cladogenesis or anagenesis, so forth. I wondered, how does agency fit into both this lower and higher level framework within the context of biology or of life?
So in the context of biology and life, obviously, I've been talking sort of quite simplistically about individuals. And as soon as you start looking at the natural world, it becomes quite hard. It just becomes very complicated. Just thinking about gut bacteria and how many things there are existing in you and how do we exactly, questions of individuation do get quite complicated. And there are creatures for whom they are more or less complicated. And, so apparently octopuses can move their tentacles partly not together partly not centrally, and partly they also have some centralized control.
So does it complexify your understanding of agency?
So, I think it would if one would. I think so. I'm trying to think about quite a simple case because I'm trying to get to the kinds of creatures that we are, and of course, even with the kinds of creatures that we are, it's complicated. Going back to the gut bacteria, and so the individuation is complicated. But there is something significant about each of our bodies and consciousness, and as dependent and interactive as we are, like nobody else holds your body up for you most of the time, and so there is also some sense in which our individuality is significant in a way that I think is also true for many other animals. So I am sort of papering over a lot of complexities about individuation in biology and taking up a simpler case. But I do think that it's a simpler case that's relevant to thinking about whatever capacities we need for human free agency. And I think it's also relevant to thinking about, your dog, because obviously, again, we're all interdependent, but still, a dog is a relatively centralized thing that moves itself as a whole. And then how one would then think about, I'm sure there are forms of agency that there would be lots of really interesting things to be said about, like octopus agency or creatures that, whatever birds are doing when they all move together in various ways. And so that would certainly complicate the case. And I'm sure there would be lots of interesting things to be said there, and I don't particularly have things to say about them. I'm not excluding them. I'm just focusing on a sort of simplified central case that I think is relevant to understanding our agency.
Bernard Bastian. Thanks so much for the talk. It was very, very interesting. I'm not sure I have all the pieces down yet, so maybe really just a clarificatory question a little bit. I'm very for the two kinds of explanation. I'm for higher order explanations and lower order explanations. So I just sort of want to get a little clearer on is that enough for agency, or what exactly do we need for agency? So I'm going to just give you two sort of other cases that are non-biological that I'd like help in thinking about. So one case is just take a hanging chain. So if you have a hanging chain, if you displace it, it'll move about. I think all the links hold together. I think you can give a roughly Newtonian explanation of why they move the way they do. But you can also give an explanation in terms of the whole. It's going to reduce its overall potential energy. That'll predict what's going to happen to the chain. If you want to, you can put a little battery on there or whatever and some motors if self-moving is an important thing. So that's one sort of case. I don't think I want to say the chain's an agent, but it's got the higher order and lower order explanations. It's got the teleological explanation and the efficient explanation. Here's another case. I think a whole bunch of us were in San Francisco recently, and they have these Waymo cars driving around, which are I couldn't stop looking at them. So those look like they satisfy a bunch of things too. I think they have a bunch of parts. I think those probably all are roughly, the one sort of explanation. And I hope that there's laws of physics mostly governing them. And I also have skepticism about, there's some sort of epistemic modesty about how physics works, and I agree with that, but nonetheless, so on and so forth. But it looks like I can also tell a story about why they're turning left in terms of whatever their cameras see and whatever they're doing. So it looks like there's new kinds of explanations available to me with the Waymo cars too. I don't think I want to call them agents, but maybe you do or not. So anyway, that's clarification, 2 more cases where it's got some of the things that I'm picking up on your talk, but I'm more hesitant to call them agents because they're not biological things.
Great. Really interesting question. So the first one, the chain, so I'm interested in things that move themselves from their point of view. So the chain, so there's lots of I would think there's lots of top-down causality that isn't agency, that's just moving wheels, and the chain I would put in terms of that. In terms of the cars, I don't want to have a ruling on whether or not there could be artificially created agents that move themselves but don't have consciousness. I think that it's not something, nature could never have come up with that, because think about how much energy and information they have to be given to, it's a wildly inefficient from the point of view of something that just has to come into existence and maintain itself without being, so they are constantly they're being given sources of energy and information all the time. So maybe if you're willing to give something enough energy and information, it can start doing things that look like things that some natural things do, and maybe it will in the end be doing those things. It's not the way nature did it. So animal agents move themselves from their point of view and having consciousness. So could there be a thing that moves itself in all the ways an animal agent does without having any consciousness? I don't really want to have a ruling on the possibility of that, but it's not what we're like, I think, and it's not what animal agency is like. What I want to say they're agents, I think I would only want to say they're agents if it makes sense to think of them as having goals and desires, which I take it doesn't, as they currently are.
I mean, you can't predict what it's going to do based by ascribing to it goals and desires. But I feel like I should pass it on. Interesting case.
I actually wanted to ask you a question as well. And I was wondering about how you're thinking about the relationship between the Cartwright view and the views and the things you've said about wields. So I could be somebody who thinks that, who is just a full-on determinist and still recognize that as far as understanding is concerned, high-level descriptions are incredibly important and much more illuminating than low-level descriptions. To think about like square pegs and round holes, for instance, there's something to be said about the trajectory of each piece, of each molecule. And then there's an explanation that's much more illuminating that tells me something at the right level of generality, for instance. But you might also think that as far as causation is concerned, just because I have understanding about the broader pattern that the particular event fits into doesn't yet mean that I have a separate notion of causation, without which I have incompleteness at the lower level. And then the Cartwright view opposes that. And I think that came out very sharply in your exchanges with Salam and with Allison. And so I was wondering how you see the relationship between the remarks you made about wields and and the Cartwright view, because you might say that, an object moves across the table when it's pulled. Well, that's true. Of course, sometimes things interfere because, for instance, maybe somebody's holding on to the object, and so they're still pulling, but there's no moving. And so in that respect, the law doesn't quite apply, but maybe it applies insofar as there is a component force. And I can see this because if I put a Newton meter on the part where the object is pulled, you'll get a displacement. Right? And so it seems to me like the Cartwright view that says that the laws of physics only apply in a very restricted domain is a claim that goes far beyond just the observation that sometimes understanding is furthered by having high-level descriptions. And so I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how you think about the relationship between offering understanding and there being causation.
Great, thanks. So I think the difference between the different levels of explanation isn't just that one is more convenient for us. I think that there are things atoms on their own can't do. And there are then things that they can do when they combined as molecules. And then there are new things that can be, so new structures can do new things, have new properties, and new things can happen once you've got new structures. So it's not just that whatever the bosons and fermions would have done on their own had no structures been created, is not going to explain what the structures are able to do. There are new, so, and maybe going back to whether or not there's causality in fundamental physics, maybe there's only causality when you've got structures that are able to do one thing or another. Nancy's views go far beyond what I want to say. So because, she's got all these claims about nature being disunified and not much of it's really governed by laws, and I don't want to commit myself on any of that. What I take from her is just that we have laws that are accurate and that, I don't know if she thinks this, but this might be saying something stronger than she thinks, but we could have laws that are accurate and precise in the domains they describe or govern, which don't say everything that's going to happen because there are other sources of motion. And so it's not that the laws are incomplete in relation to the sources of motion they govern. It's just that there are also other things. Does that get it? Not quite. Well,
I'll come to dinner.
Okay.
Yeah, great. The sort of account of agency you're providing was very tied to bodily motion of the animal or human.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering if you could say a little bit about, let's just focus on the human case. Instances of human agency just seem not to involve bodily motion. So, I mean, one sort of case, actually, maybe the one I want to set aside is some philosophers think that beliefs, emotions, and so on involve an exercise of a type of agency. But that's more controversial. Let's just focus on, I think, completely uncontroversial cases of mental action, like counting to 10. It doesn't seem like it involves any kind of bodily motion, or imagining you with a top hat on. Right? Again, so it doesn't involve like the world unfolding in some natural sense. Anyway, so has a couple places you added the qualifier and talked about embodied agency. So I don't know if you're doing like a more attenuated thing, but then I want to know how these other types of agency relate to that, or are you imagining some way in which this account can be extended?
No, so I think all agency involves, or the agency that I'm thinking about is embodied mentality. So I think that embodied minds is just, I'm taking that as a primitive notion, not mind as primitive and not physical stuff as primitive. So I'm thinking about embodied agents, but I don't have any problem with there being mental acts. Okay. Or things that such agents can do mentally. It's just that the things that are normally thought in the free will debate to be threatened by metaphysical determinism are moving your body in one way or another. And I want to make space for the possibility of doing that. So I was just focusing on that case.
Okay, but the account of agency that you give, it was harder for me to see how to extend it to the mental agent. Anyway, to the mental agency cases. But maybe I'm missing something here.
So it's true that the way I'm presenting it is I'm saying that I'm interested in minded, embodied things that can move their bodies as a whole, but I think that those things can also, just sit and think.
okay, also do other things as a whole or
Yes,
something like
yes,
that. But
yes.
yeah, I'm just having a hard time fitting in what the analog of that is. But like what's the, other than just acting, they can act as a whole, what's the thing that stands, what's the things that stands the bodily motion for counting to 10 as like?
So I think that maybe a little bit going back to Zoe's question, the like unity of consciousness, the unified deliberative point of view, that from what you act is also the unified deliberative point of view from what you think.
Okay. Okay, yeah, I was more on that's from whence the action is like eminent, but you kind of want there's the analog of the bodily change. I guess it's like a mental change for you, which is also kind of within the, yeah. Okay.
Neuron firing.
Well, that doesn't seem.
It's emotion.
Yeah, but okay, no, I think that's.
I've got the cue. I got you. Sorry.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess in some ways, right. I wanted to ask about what kind of explanation and appeal to an animal's purposes from their point of view is providing on your account. And the reason I'm asking this is in some ways I think tomorrow will bear on this, but you could, I was wondering and sort of imagining that even though you're not going a compatibilist route regarding, the relation between my explanation of an animal's motion in terms of their purposes, there's room for that in addition to these micro part explanations, genuine room. There's another kind of explanation which is from the perspective, right? But most often we're talking about it from the human being's perspective, from my perspective of what makes something to be done. And so I want to know what the relation between, my explanation of what makes something to be done, or we might imagine the explanation, although it's not, free or responsible in the way that we would give it from the animal's perspective of what makes something to be done for them. What's the relation between that kind of explanation and then the kind of explanation you're talking about? That we can give of the animal's activity in terms of its purposes? Is it just the same explanation? Am I changing the subject? So what's going on here?
So is the question about how the animal represents its purposes?
It's about the capacity to act from a unified point of view, considered as something that brings about a certain kind of event. What is the relation between that kind of explanation on your account and the kind of explanation that creatures give for their own actions from their own points of view?
So if you think about, if you see a dog scrabbling at the side of a couch trying to get something from under it, and you say, what is it doing? What is it doing? It senses that there's something underneath there, and it's trying to get to it. So, I don't really want to do, I don't want to do philosophy of mind at all, but I don't want to animal philosophy of mind. So I don't really know exactly how one wants to represent the mental states that it has, if they're beliefs or whatever they are. But it's trying to do something, and it's trying to do something that you understand from thinking about what it's perceiving and how it's moving itself in order to do this, bring about something in relation to how it's perceiving the world. So I think the two things you had were the thinking about its point of view and the conscious way in which it moves itself.
It was the explanation from its point of, so the question is, does this turn out to be a compatibilism where there's one kind of explanation that appeals to the point of view as part of a causal explanation of an event, which is then compatible with explanations of the doing from the creature's point of view itself? Or am I wrong to separate the two on your view, and instead I should see something, these basically as, as the same explanation or as two aspects of the same explanation?
Yeah, so I want to resist the idea that intentional explanations aren't part of the causal notion of agency. So there is some tendency sometimes, especially in thinking about human agency, because we can sort of just say, oh, the space of reasons, it's not a causal realm, and that's fine. So then all the determined stuff happens at the physical level, but then the space of reasons is different. But I want to say that the intentional explanation that gives us a sense of what the animal is doing and why from its point of view is part of its acting. It's part of this causal thing that's happening, which is action. But I also want to resist the idea that we need to understand action as caused by mental states. So it's not that there is some like belief and desire and then the bodily movements unfold. It's that it has this conscious control of its body, that it can move its body to do this thing that it wants to do. Am I answering you?
Thank you so much for the talk. I wanted to ask about the implications for thinking about free agency, and a sort of, it seems like there's either maybe an internal tension in your view here, or you're sort of staking out a challenging intermediate position. So you might think that freedom comes with the ability to deliberate on the basis of one's subjective experience. So the elephant can, choose to take a nap or choose to go to the watering hole on the basis of its experience, right? And I'm very receptive to this idea of sort of focusing on animals as a group and not sort of taking a sort of human exceptionalism, right? On the other hand, you might want to think that freedom and agency go together here. So there's a way in which the elephants are really free, but you're going to say, but you say here that perhaps this is verbal, but like you're going to align freedom with responsibility, with a reflective agency that's specific to human beings. And so I wonder if I should be thinking of the elephants as sort of less free than I was going to think of them as I sort of initially heard your talk. There's a part of me that wants the fact that they can sort of choose on the basis of their own good and sort of seem to have this purposive behavior that makes me want to think that they are free or responsible, at least in a minimal sense, if not a reflective sense.
So you're right. It's sort of what I'm proposing is sort of shifting how we think about the free will debate and where the freedom comes in and where the responsibility comes in. So in the free will debate, part of the debate is about what kind of capacities do we need to have in order to be liable to be held morally responsible. And part of it is how do the causal capacities we have relate to what we know about the world in physics. And I'm suggesting that second part, the causal capacities we have as being able to move our bodies from our points of view to bring about our purposes is less, I want to say it's sort of less strange than the compatibilists who think that rejecting metaphysical determinism is invoking all sorts of spooky, non-natural things. I want to say it's not spooky and unnatural. This is something that animals do. So this is an ordinary part of the world, that there are all these agents in the world that move themselves around. That's what they have to do. That's their existential condition, is that they have to move themselves all the time, and that they're carrying out their purposes all the time, and that they have to keep themselves alive all the time. And that's the causal capacity that we need for our agency. But it's not enough to get the kind of responsibility that we need. That requires different kind of cognitive capacities. So in a way, in terms of, if you're just thinking about, so when people think about in the free will debate, sometimes people are just talking about the metaphysics and the causation, and sometimes they're just talking about responsibility. If you were just thinking about the metaphysics and the causation, then I'm saying animals are also free. But in terms of the responsibility side, I think it's not appropriate to blame them for things that they do, because they don't have the capacity to reflect, the kind of reflective capacities that would be necessary for that. So I'm trying to say that for us to have the free and responsible human agency we have doesn't require, that I think is not compatible with metaphysical determinism, but doesn't require spooky, weird causal powers.
Would you say that they deserve what they get if their choices go wrong, even if we can't blame them?
I mean, there's a sense in which you could say that. So in Robert Sapolsky's book, where he's writing about why the neuroscience shows that there's no free agency, but he's got this kind of charming description of observing baboons and how the one baboon, he's like, he's going to blow it again. He always blows it. This baboon is just like not a diligent baboon. It just like does not exert its chasing after something, and then it always just kind of pulls at the wrong moment and kind of doesn't finish its action, and it's just not an excellent pursuer of baboon purposes, and it often blows it, but it's all right in the middle of its troop. So you could say, well, okay, well, he doesn't deserve to get the whatever it was that they were chasing after because he blew it, but I kind of myself wouldn't fully want to bring in desert thoughts at that point.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. So the different levels of explanation, as I hear what's happening in the project, allow us to answer a kind of threat to free agency from below. And I'm wondering if the resources here similarly allow or might, I have a slight worry that they might create a problem or like a seeming threat to freedom from above, from like higher level orders of explanation. So here's the sort of case I have in mind. So it turns out that you can predict traffic flows really well if you treat traffic as a fluid, and you don't try to model the motion of the traffic by modeling each individual decision maker's. Similarly, it might be that various macroeconomic forms of explanation, they don't go well if you then try to sort of straightforwardly go from the macroeconomic explanation and reduce it to a bunch of individual atomistic firms making decisions. But at the same time, I want to think if I'm one of those firms, I choose freely, or if I'm, as we are here, stuck in terrible traffic, like the sense in which we are agents doesn't seem to be threatened by the fact that there's a higher level order of explanation, which just at the level of the structure of the traffic could fully adequately explain the motion of the traffic flow. And this ties in a little bit with what the exchange that you had with Flo. I'm just wondering how, if there's a level of explanation one level up above my individual agency at some kind of social or aggregate level, does that in any way squeeze out the space for my agency playing a kind of important explanatory role, or having an independent explanatory role, in the same way that you might think, like, if I want to understand wheels, I don't need anything about subatomic particles. I don't want to think, if I want to understand traffic, I don't want to know anything about individual drivers, because that feels like what that would squeeze out the agents, but that feels like it goes too far in some sense.
Those are really great questions. You raised really a lot of different kinds of things. So I'll try to say a bit about some of the different kinds of things, and then you can tell me if I've got to any of it or not. So the one thing is that, so the third part, so the next part of my position is to say something about rational capacities, and then the third part of my position is to look at political and social structures. And definitely those affect, so we were just talking about desert and blame. Like, what anybody is responsible for is a very, very complicated question, which involves a lot of things about their situation and the structures in which they're acting. And those are definitely going to affect the way in which and the extent to which we can act for ourselves. I don't think they're going to affect, so now I'm not on the traffic flows, now I'm on the economic structure, the economic forces. So we're situated in, and they also actually, they're also complex systems in their own ways, and they also have feedback at all sorts of different levels, at all sorts of different ways, and we're sort of situated in the middle of them with options that are constrained by them. And so I think that's going to have a big impact on what it is for you to be able to act for yourself in the world and what it is that you're responsible for. But I don't think it changes that you're able to move your body yourself and deliberate about and think about what you're doing. So in Kant's complete account of human free agency, his final notion is external freedom, which is the freedom of all humans to exist in relations of non-domination with all other humans. And so you're not fully able on that account you're not fully able to act for yourself until you're existing in just political relations with all other humans who you could possibly affect and are affected by. So it does, there could be really quite big impacts on your agency, but I think not on the causality of your agency or on your rational capacities, or just the fact that you have them. I don't really know about the traffic flows. I mean, I do think, so John Dupre, who's this philosopher of biology who is sort of with Nancy Cartwright on being, talking about disunity and anti-reductivism, and he emphasizes a lot. So he's with Nancy Cartwright on saying that the physical world is actually not nearly as predictable as we think it is. It's only predictable under very careful circumstances. But humans are very predictable because they mostly have reasons, and so mostly they stop at traffic lights, and so actually they're quite predictable. And Hume says a purse left at Charing Cross will disappear, and we know that will happen, and because humans are very predictable. But Dupre's point is that it's actually our rational capacities that are making us predictable. So I don't know exactly what's explaining traffic being modeled as a liquid. I mean, slime molds apparently also very efficiently model how you would build transit systems. So I don't know. I don't know how one thinks of what that modeling is doing as a complete explanation. I would sort of need to know more about how it's being thought of as in that way.
Hi, thank you. So my question is, what type of mistake, if any, one makes when one offers an explanation at the micro level to explain something like, why am I seated here? So Plato has an answer for this in the Phaedo. So in order to explain why Socrates is in jail waiting for the hemlock to come, it's not really his sinus, his bones, why he's seated there, but rather the decisions that he made to not run away. And he says that, Socrates Plato, that to offer an explanation of why is he there, not running away, but rather about to await his sentence, by only giving the information about his sinus and bones, would be epistemically lazy. So it will give you something, but it's not really what it gets it close, but it doesn't fulfill the request fully. So I was wondering if you think that an explanation of this kind, like on micro level from the macro level, it's also lazy, or if there's a mistake actually the one can pinpoint to.
I don't know. I don't know if lazy is the term I would use, because I think it would be so much harder to explain it by going for the micro level. What I would want to say is that there are things which just aren't really explainable at that level, just don't really make sense. Like all the things that are happening in living things that are sort of pursuing purposes and keeping themselves alive, like if the bosons and fermions are just going to do what they're doing anyway, why do the living things need to go to so much effort? It looks like the bosons and fermions have become arranged into structures that just seem sort of crazy coincidences from the point of view of just the microphysical laws, but that really make sense when you understand all these complex structures and the different possibilities and things that they have. So it's not so much that I think it's lazy as that I think it just leaves all these enormous why questions just sort of unexplained, for which there are explanations involving other kinds of structures.
Mm-hmm. Perfect, thank you.
Well, with apologies to everybody I didn't get to, let's thank our speaker.